Hello, Magic players and collectors. Welcome back to the Land Library. I'm your librarian, and in this episode of Latest Loadout, I'm going over the Final Fantasy set. This is a Universes Beyond set, but is actually standard legal, as opposed to, I think, every other Universes Beyond set which have not been. This came out on June 13th of 2025, and is obviously all about Final Fantasy, getting characters, monsters, items, and most importantly for us, locations, from all across every main series Final Fantasy game. Obviously, the first thing on the list of returns is the basics, but the basics are a little bit different from normal. There's only full arts this time, and each of the 5 basics gets 3 different arts. I'm going a little slow so I can have a little bit of extra time to show you them all, because they don't really fit on one image well. There also is surge foils of all 5 basics, but only 1 art for each. And they printed wastes in this set, which just has the 1 art, but it's super awesome to see wastes coming back in a standard set. Wastes hasn't been standard legal for several years, so it's pretty awesome that it's back. And that's actually all for the main set, just basics. But there's one more returning land that's at least in packs, which is Balam Garden, which is a reskin of Command Beacon. This is from the Through the Ages subset, which is basically this set's version of Special Guests, which means that this is not going to be standard legal, and this land can, of course, tap for a colorless or tap and sack to move your commander from the command zone to your hand, which would be pretty useless in standard anyway. Which brings us to the Commander set. Normally, I'd throw a lot of the lands from the Commander set into Rapid Fire for having nothing new, but this time, every single land in the Commander set has brand new art. So, we're just not going to have a Rapid Fire, and this might be a kinda long section. Let's start with the usual suspects like Command Tower. This land gets new prints and new art all the time, but this time around, it's getting 4 brand new arts. And I don't think I really need to explain Command Tower. If you watch my videos, you should know. But I will anyways, since that's what I do here. It of course taps for a single mana of any color in your commander's color identity. And another very commonly seen card, Path of Ancestry, which also taps for a mana in your commander's color identity, except this one comes in tapped, and if the mana is spent on casting a creature with a matching creature type to your commander, which does include your commander itself, you scry 1. And yet another classic, Evolving Wilds. This is a fetch land that taps and sacks to search out any basic and put it in play tapped, along with Ash Barrens, which can tap for a colorless, and has basic land cycling 1, which is basically the same effect, but from hand and costs 1 mana. Another super commonly reprinted card, Rogue's Passage. This can tap for a colorless, or you can pay 4 generic and tap to make a target creature unblockable for the turn. And can't forget Bonder's Enclave, a land that taps for a colorless, or you can pay 3 and tap it to draw a card, as long as you have a creature in play with at least 4 power. Next up, Temple of the False God, which taps for 2 colorless as long as you have 5 or more lands in play. And yet another classic, Exotic Orchard. This land simply taps for a mana that any opponent's land could produce. And I hope you like deserts, because the next land is Scavenger Grounds. This land with a desert subtype taps for a colorless, or for 2 generic it taps and sacks a desert card to exile everyone's graveyards. Finishing off these cards is Spire of Industry. This land can tap for a colorless, or pay 1 life and tap for any color, but only if you control an artifact. These all get lots of prints, but now it's time for some that don't get quite as many prints, like Demolition Field. This land taps for a colorless, or can pay 2 to tap and sack to destroy an opponent's non-basic land, then you both search your libraries for a basic land to replace them both with. And Forge of Heroes, which has only been printed twice before. This land can tap for a colorless, or can tap to add a 1/1 counter to a commander that entered this turn, or 1 loyalty counter if it's a planeswalker instead of a creature. Next up is High Market, which can also tap for a colorless, or can tap and sack a creature to gain 1 life. And yet another land that taps for colorless, Slayer's Stronghold, but that's not the only thing it does. It also, at the cost of a red and white mana, can tap to give a target creature +2/+0 haste and vigilance until the end of turn. And our last land before getting into cycles is Nesting Grounds. This land also taps for colorless, or, at sorcery speed, can pay a generic and tap to move any counter, from one of your permanents to another of your permanents. Finally, through all those single lands, which means it's time to go over all the dual color cycles. Or actually, only mostly dual colors, because there's also a set of tricolors. 4 of the pure tap tricolors: Arcane Sanctum, Jungle Shrine, Nomad Outpost, and Seaside Citadel. And now we're on to duels. Starting with another group of 4, we've got Battlefield Forge, Brushland, Sulphurous Springs, and Underground River, which are all pain lands. These can tap for a colorless, or can tap for one of their 2 colors at the cost of 1 life. And then we've got a full cycle of allied colored battle lands. These are lands with basic subtypes and come in tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands. And included are Canopy Vista, Cinderglade, Prairie Stream, Smoldering Marsh, and Sunken Hollow. And on the topic of lands with basic subtypes, there's also 8 of the typal tap lands. These lands just come in tapped and have basic land types. The ones getting printed in this set are Contaminated Aquifer, Geothermal Bog, Idyllic Beachfront, Radiant Grove, Sacred Peaks, Sunlit Marsh, Tangled Islet, and Wooded Ridgeline. And there's another set of 8, this time the basic reveal lands, including Choked Estuary, Foreboding Ruins, Fortified Village, Fury Calm Snarl, Game Trail, Port Town, Shine Shadow Snarl, and Vine Glimmer Snarl. These lands come in tapped unless you reveal 1 land of the corresponding basic types from your hand. And that is basic types, not basics. In a similar vein, there's also 8 of the basic check lands. These come in tapped unless you already control a land with one of their corresponding basic types. Once again, basic types, not basics. For those, we got Clifftop Retreat, Dragon Skull Summit, Drowned Catacomb, Glacial Fortress, Interland Harbor, Isolated Chapel, Rootbound Crag, and Sunpetal Grove. Now, for a much smaller group, we've got 3 of the temples: Temples of Enlightenment, Mystery, and Plenty. These, of course, are just dual colors that come in tapped and scry 1 when they enter. Now, all that's left are 2 cycles of filter lands. There's the classic filter lands introduced in Odyssey that cost 1 generic and tap to add both of their colors, including Darkwater Catacombs, Desolate Mire, Mossfire Valley, Overflowing Basin, Shadowblood Ridge, Skycloud Expanse, Sungrass Prairie, and Sunscorched Divide. And the other set are the Graven Cairns filter lands. These, instead of taking a generic, take one of their own colors and produce 2 in any combination of their colors instead of just the pair. Additionally, they can just tap for a colorless if you want. The ones included this time are Fetid Heath, Firelit Thicket, Flooded Grove, Graven Cairns, Rugged Prairie, and Sunken Ruins. And that's all of the returning lands. Starting off with a bit of a weird one, we have Side Quest Catch a Fish. And you might be thinking, wait a second, that's an enchantment, not a land. But this enchantment transforms into a land. The enchantment side costs 2 generic and a white to play, and while in play, you check the top card of your library during your upkeep. If it's a creature or artifact, you can put it in your hand and then make a food token and transform it into Cooking Campsite. Or, alternatively, you could just put it back and not make a food token and transform it. But as a land, Cooking Campsite can tap for a white, or at sorcery speed, for a 3 generic, it taps and sacks an artifact to add a 1/1 counter to all of your creatures. And then we get to Adventurer's Inn, which can tap for a colorless and gives you 2 life when it enters the battlefield. But wait, what's this? Subtype Town? Town is a brand new subtype introduced in this set, at least officially, since there's actually a couple of playtest cards that have already come out with the subtype Town, but playtest cards aren't officially recognized in the rules, so Town wasn't officially added until this set, and every other land in this set is also a town. Let's keep going with the individual lands, so we've got Starting Town up next. Starting Town is the newest take on an old classic. It taps for a colorless or can tap for any color at the cost of a life, and it has another interesting effect where it enters tapped unless it's within your first 3 turns. On to Capital City, which has pretty similar abilities. It can also tap for colorless or tap for any color, but this time at the cost of a mana instead of a life, making this a filter land instead. Also, Capital City just comes in untapped all the time, and has Cycling 2 as an extra option. Staying with the any colored lands, the next one is Crossroad Village. This land can make any color, but it chooses only one color to lock into when it enters, and it enters tapped. And with those multicolors out of the way, let's move on to the colorless ones, starting with Clive's Hideaway. This land, very fittingly, has Hideaway 4, which is actually the first time since the original Lorwyn Hideaway lands, which introduced a keyword back in 2007, that Hideaway has been printed on a land again. And it also taps for a colorless or for 2 generic, taps to play the card it hid away without paying its printed mana cost. But this second ability can only be activated while you control at least 4 legendary creatures. Moving on to the next colorless land, it's Eden's Seat of the Sanctum. This land taps for a colorless, or for 5 generic, it taps and mills 2 cards from your library, and then you can either choose the end of the effect there, or continue and sacrifice Eden to return a different permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. And surprisingly, despite only being an uncommon card, it also has a borderless art version. And the final colorless land of this set is the Gold Saucer. This land can tap for a colorless, or for 2 generic and a tap, you flip a coin. If you correctly call the coin flip, you create a treasure token. Or, as a third ability, it can pay 3 generic to tap and sacrifice 2 artifacts and draw 1 card. Which leaves just one more solo land before we get into the cycles, which is Balam Garden Seed Academy, a Simic-colored land that enters tapped and taps for either of its colors, or for 5 generic and a green and a blue, or 1 generic less for each town you control. It transforms into Balam Garden Airborne, a 5/4 legendary vehicle with flying, and only crew 1, with the additional effect that when it attacks, you draw a card. It also has a borderless art version, which is borderless on both sides. Now we finally get to the full cycle of all 10 dual colors in the form of the towns. And yes, pretty much all of the new lands are towns, but these are distinguished by basically only that subtype. These are essentially guild gates, so they just come in tapped and tap for either of their colors, but this time with the subtype town instead of gate. These include Barren Airship Kingdom, Gone Town of Ruin, Gaganga Reactor Town, Guad Solemn Farplane Getaway, Insomnia Crown City, Rabanastre Royal City, Charlayan Nation of Scholars, Treno Dark City, Vector Imperial Capital, and Windurst Federation Center. And last but not least is a cycle of monocolored lands with adventures on them. Real quick, if you don't know how adventures work, it's basically just a spell on a different card that can be cast from your hand just like a normal spell, but only exists as that spell while on the stack, and is considered the main card on all other zones. And then it gets exiled after use instead of going to the graveyard, but the other main part of the card can still be played from exile as long as it was exiled from the adventure. These adventure lands share a few traits in common, like they all have a borderless version, and the same land effects, but each has its own unique adventure. The green adventure on Xanarkand, Ancient Metropolis, is sorcery speed and costs 4 generic and 2 green to create a 1/1 colorless hero creature token with 1/1s on it equal to the number of lands you control. The red adventure on Lindblom Industrial Regency is instant speed, costing 2 generic and a red. It creates a 0/1 black wizard creature token with the ability that it does 1 damage to all opponents every time you cast a non-creature spell. The black adventure on Midgar City of Mako is sorcery speed and costs 2 generic and a black, letting you sacrifice an artifact or creature to draw 2 cards. although it says you may sacrifice something if you do draw those cards, which means you can still play this and choose no targets, or even while there are no valid targets, to do nothing and just exile the card. Not sure that'd be helpful, but it is an option. The blue adventure on Jador Aristocratic Capital is sorcery speed and costs 4 generic and 2 mana to mill half of a target player's library. And the final adventure in white on Ishgard, the Holy See, is sorcery speed again and costs 3 generic and 2 white to put up to 2 enchantments or artifacts from your graveyard back into your hand. And after all that, the land part of these cards, which is the same on all of them, is they just come in tapped and they tap for their color. This set has a lot of interesting lands, but only a few are actually any good, at least in Standard. The cycle of dual-colored towns is basically useless outside of drafting, because there's barely anything that interacts with towns, and without that, they're just kind of pure tap lands, which just isn't good enough to compete with other standard legal duels like Burge's Surveil lands or Fast lands. And Capital City has a lot of competition for its spot as a mana-fixing land, too. Cards like Crystal or Hidden Grotto, Conduit Pylons, and Captivating Cave already are around and give much better options than a Cycling 2. Not to mention, most decks in Standard don't really bother running much color fixers anyway, so it's competing for a role that isn't very in demand. Which kinda goes the same for Crossroads Village. Locking into one color is probably a little more useful, but it's pretty irrelevant in a one or two colored deck, so you can just use duals and monocolored lands with better effects. It might see a little more play in multicolored commander decks, since its subtype can potentially make it more interactable, but once again, there's not a lot of things that interact with towns, so not by a lot. And all the colorless towns are kinda weak, but have a bit of a place in Commander. Adventurers Inn is an okay option for a life gain deck, especially if you have a way to bounce it and replay it, but just playing a land is pretty free life gain and an easy way to trigger effects. Clive's Hideaway is pretty good, letting you potentially play something for only 2 generic mana. It's a great way to cheat big creatures into play, but its requirement of 4 legendaries is a bit more better suited for Commander. Eden is maybe an okay pick for like a dredge deck with its milling ability to get a card back from your graveyard, but its high cost makes it not especially appealing even then. And the gold saucer is kind of just gambling plus card draw in treasure decks. It's not exactly the best way to make treasure tokens, but it is a decent way to turn excess treasure tokens into card draw if that's what you want over mana. And now we're starting to get into the good stuff. Side quest Catch a Fish is a great option to check the top card of your library, although that's not really the strongest effect. This is a really good way to do it. And it can get an extra card into your hand, plus it makes a food and its land ability to put 1/1s on all of your creatures repeatably is quite good, especially in something like a Proliferate deck where you're already wanting a lot of 1/1s. Next up is Balam Garden, the Seed Academy one, not the Just Balam Garden reskin. Its transformation cost is a bit steep unless you're running towns, which there are actually some pretty good towns, so that doesn't sound too far-fetched even in Standard. But once it's transformed, it's a powerful 5/4 flying vehicle with only Crew 1. Crew 1 is so cheap for a 5/4 flying, and it gives extra card draw on top of everything else. This would definitely be a great card for drafting, and it's pretty okay for constructed formats, but I don't really suspect it'll see a lot of competitive play. But what most likely will see competitive play is the adventure towns, some of them at least. Xanarkand probably won't. It gets much more value from lots of lands and is pretty costly, so basically the longer the game goes, the better this card gets. And with the quick pace of Standard, it's unlikely to actually see much play because you can't get a lot of value out of it, or potentially maybe even pay for the cost. But in Commander, especially decks like Landfall that are very land heavy, I can see this card popping off. Ishgard has a nice effect, getting stuff back out of your graveyard, but it also is quite expensive, so I think it's pretty much in the same boat of better in Commander. because it's going to be really hard to actually get value out of that in fast-paced standard. Now, Jador is pretty good, and with Mistrais Village from the last set giving it the option to be uncounterable, it's quite the powerful combo. Its only real problem is that it's also very expensive. 6 mana, making it pretty tough to actually use in Standard. It's a bit of a gambit to run it in Standard, but if you do actually get it out, it's pretty worth it. Now, in Commander, this is way less of a problem and is even more powerful, being able to mill even more cards, and is an excellent card for Miller Dredge decks. Lindblom is much cheaper than the previous three, making it significantly more viable in Standard, and is even at instant speed, the only one of these adventure lands with an instant adventure. It puts a creature token in play, which isn't the most powerful stat-wise, but it is comboable by adding creatures. Things definitely have effects that pop when creatures enter the battlefield. But it also adds an extra 1 damage to all opponents to every non-creature spell, going exceptionally well in any burn deck. But the best adventure town, for Standard at least, is Midgar. It has a cheap cost and sacrifices 1 card for 2 draw. This can be paired with lots of creatures that get an effect off of being sacrificed, on top of the good card draw. It has all the parts of a desirable card, good effect, combo potential, and reasonable cost. It's definitely going to see play in Standard, and is probably kind of meta. But the best land in the set is hands down Starting Town. Any colored mana at the cost of 1 life has always been good. Just look at the legacy of City of Brass. Plus, it has the backup option of making a colorless for no life if that's all you need. It comes in untapped on your first 3 turns, giving you instant early access to any color in the early game, which can be super important in the very fast-paced Standard. Starting Town is a huge enabler of actually running like tricolor or higher decks, which probably for Standard is not really going to be like Wooburg or anything, but especially since it's coming in right after a tricolor-focused set, it's shifting the metagame to have more tricolor decks. And with a subtype, it is potentially a bit more searchable and interactable with other cards. Granted, I've said this twice already, but there's not a lot of interaction with towns, but some is still automatically better than none. This land is definitely a meta-level card already seeing competitive play, and will likely see plenty of play in all formats it's legal in. For Standard, this is a 5 out of 5. Plenty of decent lands for lower-leveled Standard, multiple meta-relevant lands, and even a land that's completely shifting the meta. This set's lands are making a huge impact on Standard. For Commander, this is also a 5 out of 5. With Commander powerhouses like the Adventure Towns and Starting Town, and lots of other smaller support for various decks like Dredge, Mill, and Life Gain, this can't be anything other than a 5. The theme is a 5 out of 5. Of course it's a 5 out of 5. It's a Universes Beyond set. Those are basically just theme incarnate. The art is a solid 9 out of 10. The art in this set is great. New art on every returning land, several borderless arts, only full art basics, surge foil basics, and even essentially a special guest card. This set doesn't have any showcase cards at all, so I can't really hold no showcase cards against it, which means that the only thing missing is an extended art land. There are extended arts in this set, just none of them are land. And I'm giving out 1 bonus point for introducing a new land subtype. It's pretty rare to get them, and at least to me, that's a pretty big deal. This will also go to any other set. This isn't exclusive to this one. If you introduce a new subtype, you get a bonus point. Overall, that's a 25 out of 25. Whew, wow, that's a perfect score. The first one I've given out. And the set really does have amazing lands. Tons of new art, special prints, meta relevancy, a new subtype, even bringing wastes back into Standard. They went all out, and I appreciate it. If you've made it this far in the video, please drop a like for turn and subscribe for more Landfield content. If I missed anything, got anything wrong, or you just have questions, let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next latest loadout. the next set, Edge of Eternities, comes out.